I'm Wiradjuri. I was born in Wagga, New South Wales, and I grew up with 3 generations of women. My nana, Lil Croker, married a settler called James Smart and had 12 children, and the youngest was my mum, Jenny. So that's my line through Lil Croker, and she was born at Gundagai on the river, and I was born just a bit further down the river at Wagga Wagga. And I grew up literally on the road to Gundagai. And so I know all the settler songs about Gundagai, but Nana taught us more of the old songs as well, and the old stories that that we didn't get to sing at school, but that I always remember. So yeah, I grew up there on country, and I lived there till I was 19. Then I left to go to uni, went to northern New South Wales for a while, and then I came back down south, not quite to Gundagai, but to Canberra, which is on the same river. No, look, unfortunately I didn't. We used to know a few words. I mean, all the place names around where I live are all Wiradjuri. Like there's Gundagai, Tumut, Adjunbilly, Wanabadgery, which means big hill. Like we knew all the words of places, that we knew what they meant. Yeah, Wiradjuri, Illabo, which is a billabong, Bathungra, which is a plain. They're all Wiradjuri words. So very few of the words in Wiradjuri country have been changed, actually. And for those local words around us, like Kuanini and Adjunbilly, Wanabadgery, which is a huge hill, Jeanine, which is flats. Nana knew the meaning of all those words. So we grew up with those words and knowing what they meant and knowing they had an older, deeper meaning. But unfortunately, no, and my mother or the aunties weren't allowed to speak Wiradjuri either, just weren't allowed to speak it at school when they did go to school, a little bit, even through the night, because my oldest auntie was born in like 1907. So yeah, had a little bit of schooling. And one of my aunties was actually quite literate, but none of them were allowed to speak Wiradjuri. It's been like having something that was my birthright that was taken away from us, not forever, but that was taken away from us for quite a while. And it was like having your birthright back. It's like getting your inheritance back, but not a material inheritance, but something much richer. Look, before I was fortunate enough to be invited to the First Languages project, I decided I wanted to learn myself, because a lot of work was done, particularly by Uncle Stan Grant, and about bringing the language back. And Uncle Stan lived in Canberra for quite a while, so I was fortunate enough to know him there, and I knew he was doing a Wiradjuri language program in some of the primary schools around that way. So I started teaching myself a bit, and I'm still not good at it, but I feel so empowered by the words that I do know and that I can claim. And then a couple of years ago, Uncle Stan, with this other guy called John Rudder, who's an academic, put out a dictionary, a Wiradjuri dictionary. Have you seen that? It's like a brick, and it's just like, it's precious. And as well as words, it's got phrases in it. So before I was invited to the Poetry in First Languages project, I was asked to write a non-fiction poem for another publication called Offshoot, which was about methodologies in life writing. And I decided that I was going to write something partially in Wiradjuri for that, and I called it Gatherers, because I've always thought about gatherers. Like the women in my family were great gatherers of of things that, you know, like material things, like they're always gathering up bits of food or bits of wool off farms, things that people wouldn't think were useful, but they would gather them up. But they're also, so physically they were great gatherers, but they're also great gatherers of stories. And they held on to all these little stories, and they used to tell stories about how you connected to people, and or how we're connected to place, or they told me lots of things that happened at places before I was born. So that sort of gathering. So I decided I was going to write a poem, and I just sat down with a dictionary and started writing it, and it was just amazingly therapeutic. I thought, for the poem, I thought about the story of my great-grandmothers who would have been taught together, like on traditional country. And then I thought about the coming of colonialism in that poem and the taking away of certain things. But I also thought about the power of gathering stories and custodianship, of keeping the stories and storing them in a safe place, like my nana did, like my aunties did, in the baskets of their memories, which I wrote in the poem. Storing them, keeping them safe, and bringing out these gatherings again later. When I was invited because I'd done another project with the Red Room, which was also an incredibly important project, and I reckon I wrote one of my best poems for that, which was the Disappearing project. Because I wrote about things disappearing and then resurfacing. And in particular, I wrote about the Gundagai Bridge. And to write for that project, I went back and spent time on country that I realised when I went back to write that project that I hadn't let myself spend enough time in country over the last decade or so of my life, and that I let other things that I thought were important, in some ways they were, but they weren't as important as being on country, get in the way, you know, like work and commitments. So when I went back to write for the Disappearing, I spent time under the bridge, I spent time on the river, I spent time walking around the creeks and the hills, and I saw all these different things, the rocks, the granite, the dirt, the colours, and I remembered thinking I should know a word for each one of these things. And I felt at that moment incredibly humble and incredibly kind of deprived in a way that I didn't. But then when I was invited to, I had this thing in my head, I should know these words. When I was invited to write for the Poetry and First Nations project with the Red Room, I went to a senior woman, a Wiradjuri woman, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for, Auntie Carrie Reed Gilbert in the First Nations Writers Network, and I asked for some advice about a language custodian. Who will I work with? And she recommended her wonderful cousin, Auntie Elaine Lomas, who is a really senior custodian of Wiradjuri language. And that connection was just magic. And Elaine just encouraged me to express myself. She just said, you just express yourself, and then we'll see how we work together translating them or interpreting them. And because it's more like interpretation, because you can't always do an exact translation. So one of the first things I thought of was how much I need to unlearn, and that's how these words came to me. That poem, like, these words, I should have always had these words, but I didn't. But now I'm going to learn to make them again. And it was like learning to talk for the first time. And while that might sound incredibly disempowering it wasn't. It was incredibly empowering, and it was like being born again, you know, like it's like having your life, someone saying you can live your life again. And so that's the origin of these words, just coming back and knowing now that I can, it's going to be a process, but that I can have these words. Yeah, so it's a renewal, it was a rebirth. I spent a lot of time on landscape because I lived out of town, and as a child, being one of a few Aboriginal kids in the school in Gundagai, and also being out of town and being with a family that were used to being a bit isolated, I spent a lot of time on land, and I love rocks. My sister and I used to spend a lot of time playing on rocks on a hill when we were little. We used to make, well, we didn't actually have to make anything. The rocks were made themselves, but we used to pretend we were in castles and forts, and we used to play games that we used to imagine that, we used to say, imagine this is the olden days and we live under these rocks, or we live in this cave, you know. And I love the rocks. I love granite and the way it looks on hills, and that beautiful grey, silver grey colour that changes all the time in the light. And my nana used to say the rocks on Wiradjuri country are really something special, and that's one of the things that's really saved country as well, like saved a lot of country, because a lot of Wiradjuri country was simply too hilly and too rocky, too many of those big granite outcrops for the farmers, not too many for us, of course, to cultivate, and there was nowhere where I walked that I didn't encounter fences from time to time. But the fences, even the fences out that way, had to sort of flow with the country a bit more, rather than, because it wasn't flat, so I just had to build fences along hill lines and things like that. So we used to spend a lot of time around rocks, around waterfalls, around natural landscapes. The aunties used to take us out and teach us the names of plants, and show us different things that used to grow on country at different times. So a lot of time on natural landscape, but then also I was exposed very much through school and through later through study to built landscapes as well. And I got kind of used to thinking about what they might be built on, built over. And the term mythscape is something that's come to me more recently when I've thought about turning the idea of myth on its head, because myths is something that people used to always say, well, Aboriginal people have myths, and we took exception to that, of course, because of the origin of the word myth. And it's actually, I thought about it more and more, and when you think about it, you can turn that around and you think, well, actually it's settlers who have myths about what these buildings are built on top of, or these stories that they have written over the top of, or tried to write over the top of. Fortunately, they haven't succeeded. And I always say my memory's like a steel trap. Things go in there and they just stay there. So mythscape is a word that I've been just thinking about a lot in the last couple of years, as a way to talk back to the colonial environment, the buildings and the stories that have been around for the last 200 years or so. I'm working on a series of poems, actually, that I've just called Mythscape poems. One, for example, that I was working on a bit last night was called Oh Australia, which is the first part of the poem, just like, it's written like sectionalised up, like in fences, and the first part of the poem just talks about all these cliches, all these Australian cliches, like I want to catch the first fleet, and I want to take up land, and I want to stand in Australia, and I want to own my piece of it, and it just, but then the second part seeks to turn that mythscape upside down by saying, oh, Australia, you've become a poor fellow, my country, Australia, what you buried is screaming up at you, what you hid is revealing itself, etc. So I'm working on some poems that are just called Mythscape that as a series, and it's also been a really important experience here to go out and engage with the older landscape, because here at Bundanon, actually, it's a really good place to write because, I mean, we're sitting here among buildings, we're sitting here in a mythscape, but just down the road and where we were this morning working with the students, that's pretty much old growth, trees and natural landscape. So I'm interested in writing about the mythscape as opposed to the landscape, but I'm also interested, like I always am, in the meeting place of the two of them and how one will never really drown out the other. Yeah, well, there's this, apart from, I just said there's a beautiful kind of environment to write in, and all these beautiful places you can walk to. But in addition to that, there is the space. Like the Bundanon is designed as an artist's residency, so it's really made to work in. I find that one of the things that I found a bit of a challenge was that you get too busy with other things, whereas when you're here, you just let yourself have the space. And it's fitted out for artists, so we have these great studio spaces to work in when you're not outside. And one of the things I've been finding really useful has been alternating between the two, writing, sitting outside and writing. I've been for quite a lot of walks up on the hill, so writing around there, and then also coming back inside to write later on in the afternoon and at night. And it's beautiful and quiet here, you know, and one of the things that produce really good writing is just sustained time with no interruptions, and it gives me the opportunity to do that. And the limited access, mobile access, and is really useful. You can sort of get too dependent on phones and that kind of technology, and it can take you away from things. So being here has brought me back to centre myself. And other things that I've been also working on while I'm here, I'm alternating between these two projects, is I'm working on a memoir, which is a story of my story and my mother's story. And it's a combination, it's a blurred genre between prose and poetry, and I think it pushes the boundaries of what those genres can do. And that's in its earlier stages, but having the space to work on that here has been really important. First of all, it's a privilege to be asked to do that. And when I was asked last year to work with some of the emerging writers and some of the established writers too, who were writing in language for the first time, I thought, like, it's a great privilege. I think I was born to be a teacher, and I have always taught or had that sort of mentoring role in some ways, that I like to work with other people to help them realise their potential. In particular with the First Nations poetry and having this editorial role, it's been really enriching for me to see all the different languages, how they look. And even when you don't know a language, there's a way in which I feel that it's really important to help the poet, the writer, centre that language and make that the central feature of their poem, and to to put in place some protocols that I've noticed over time that are largely missing from other editorial practices. So I aim to work with the voice of the poem that's already there and the words that people have already chosen, and just offer suggestions and comments about how it might look better on a page, because in the end we do, as far as the Red Room goes and as far as all poetry goes really that we want people to read, it has to go on a page in the end, or on some surface. It could go I know Red Room poetry goes on buses and buildings and sidewalks, which is great, but they're also, in a way, like pages too. They're a surface that you have to set the words out on. So having that privilege, and then being able to develop some protocols that have been largely missing from other editorial practices that I've noticed in my previous experience has been, it's important, as you said, but it's also just a tremendous privilege. It's a big honour to have that, and to and working with some of the poets last year and seeing their work just grow, and their work and their confidence just grow, has just been incredible. And, you know, from meeting people who say things like, oh, I've never done it before, I'm not sure, I only know a few words, and then watching how that changes. Yeah, and how people have come from seeing themselves as not a poet to, in the end, just without even thinking, referring to themselves as poets and saying things like my poetry. It's really special.